Traditional Catholic Pharisees, the Novus Ordo, and Sunday obligation. On the weekend, I tweeted a lengthy tweet, more of a blog post if I'm being honest, and I guess it's now called X, so I X'd, I guess, or I posted on X. And this was about Sunday obligation as it pertains to the Novus Ordo Missae, the new rite of Mass. You can check out the tweet if you'd like. It did have a generally speaking positive response, although there were some people who took issue with it. And essentially, the argument is as follows. Because of all the problems surrounding the Novus Ordo, which have been documented in many cases, both the actual implementation of it in the 1970s and how egregiously that was done, and also how in most cases it's celebrated in a subpar, if not outright, liturgically abusive manner, and the fact that it contains in it a deficient and potentially harmful, if not dubious, theology, even if it's not outright heretical. Because of all these reasons, it presents a danger to the faith, or at least a potential danger to the faith, and therefore these should be considered when people say you must go to the Novus Ordo kind of no matter what if nothing else is available to go to Mass. And I explained these reasons in the tweet, and they were probably more laid out than the ones I just said right now, but nonetheless, I think I did a half-decent job. And if I'm being honest, I was drawing on the wisdom of Dr. Kwasniewski. You can read a series of articles from him that he has recently published at his Substack, and I recommend everybody go do that because they are incredible, and they say things in a way that is much more intelligent than I'm even capable of, and he lays out these principles much better than I. But what I want to talk about here is not the argument for or against a particular opinion about Sunday obligation, more about the philosophical underpinnings that are at the root of how people respond to such a problem. So, as you can imagine, aside from the positive responses, there were a variety of negative responses. And the negative responses varied from slightly critical but sympathetic to, Kennedy, you're a Pharisee. Or one person said, Kennedy is outside the church, he is a Protestant, which I found interesting. Protestant who prays his rosary, and I've got a statue of the Virgin Mary right there. It's pretty strange for a Protestant. Anyway, it made me think, what is it with these responses? Why is it that when you bring up the liturgy of the church and the traditional theology of the church, that when people are confronted with something that they find to be difficult for the way they understand things, that one of the first things they do is level accusations at you as being a Pharisee, a Protestant, and so forth? Well, there's a variety of reasons for that. I'd like to go through my general thoughts on that today. First things first, we have to understand or consider what a Pharisee is, because I don't think people really know what a Pharisee is, and I don't think they know how they're using that term. The caricature or the stereotype of a Pharisee is an old fuddy-duddy or a rigorist, someone who takes seriously, the more serious matters of religion and has no charity, has no compassion, and so on and so forth, and therefore, you must be a Pharisee. So they will say traditional Catholics who don't go to the Novus Ordo really are just Pharisees because all they care about is the letter of the law. But actually, it's completely the opposite. Now, of course, any Catholic, any Christian for that matter, is capable of falling into the sin of being Pharisaical. This is why Christ warns us of this. You can be a Pharisee if you attend the traditional Mass. You can be a Pharisee if you attend a Byzantine liturgy. You could be a Pharisee if you attend the Novus Ordo. It's totally possible for anyone to do that. It's really a problem with the heart, not necessarily a problem with the worship. At any rate, the way that we worship does demonstrate what we believe. The lex orandi is the lex credendi. As the church says, the law of prayer is the law of belief. How you pray will affect how you believe. So, if we look at the will of God in the church in the last 20 centuries, we find something very clear. We find that around the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, you find a distillation of liturgical practices, especially in the West, as well as in the East, but we're talking about Roman Catholic, Latin Rite Roman Catholics here. You find that the liturgical practices are distilled to the point that by the time you get to St. Gregory the Great in the 5th or 6th century, whenever the exact date was, you find him codifying a liturgy that looks much more like the traditional Latin Mass we're used to today than anything else, and that had already been in use for a long time and sort of stamped it, locked it, can't erase it. This is liturgy of the Church in the West. Then for 15 centuries roughly, or 14 or so, we have this, generally speaking, unified practice of Catholic religion by Latin Rite Christians, and this is how they believe their faith. And consequently, you see over those many centuries, you see a unity in belief. There are obviously times of heresy, there are obviously times of disorder, whether that be problems in the hierarchy or in the society and so forth, and there are problems there, but you don't see a widespread falling away from the faith. In fact, you do only see these widespread falling away from the faith, or with a widespread falling away from the faith, you almost always find a complete rejection of the traditional liturgy of the Church. If you look into the Albigensian problems around the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, you find there they start doing some weird things with liturgical rites. Of course, you can find these things with the heresies of the Protestants. There's a wholesale change to liturgy and so on and so forth. The reason is because if you worship in the way Catholics have always worshipped, or at least in the way that the Holy Ghost has willed that Catholics will worship in perpetuity, which we see by the fact that this is the will of God throughout the centuries and it hasn't changed, what you find is that accompanying that way of worship is a way of belief. This is the clear understanding of the lex orandi, lex credendi. Then we find in the 1970s we have a completely fabricated liturgy. Even the defender of the Novus Ordo, by appealing to antiquity, picking and choosing pieces here and there, I think would have to admit that the Novus Ordo is clearly not the Roman Rite. It's clearly not the extension of the traditional Latin Mass as it's been understood for 15 centuries. It's something else entirely. And with that, you find a complete change in the orthodoxy of the average Catholic. This shouldn't shock us. This is because accompanying a change in the way we pray is a change in the way we believe. So as someone who loves the Church, as someone who believes the Catholic Church is a divine institution, as someone who believes that it's possible for the divine institution of the Church with its human element to go through upheavals and storms, I believe that the Novus Ordo has been a grave mistake, and I believe that it's harmed souls greatly. And I believe that when I look around and I see the proliferation of the Novus Ordo and the general apostasy, which is basically what it's been, of falling away from the Church either completely from religion or going into Protestantism in many cases, I believe the Novus Ordo is going to have something to do with that. Call me crazy. I think there is a cause and an effect. It's not the only cause, but I believe it's an important one. So I say to myself, I really don't want to be a part of this thing that I think has, generally speaking, harmed Catholic faith. Now, before we continue, there are going to be exceptions to this. There are always exceptions to rules. So-and-so will say, well, my grandma went to the Novus Ordo until she died, and she's a saint. Well, God bless her. I hope she was a saint, and that's probably true. But your grandma wasn't raised in the Novus Ordo. She kept her faith after the Mass changed. Or you'll say, well, so-and-so raised a bunch of kids, and they all came out faithful. That's great. The exception proves the rule, because for every father who raises his children up in the Novus Ordo and they end up staying Catholic, often what you'll find is that they end up finding tradition anyway, which is very common, or they end up going Byzantine because there's tradition there. Or if they do keep it, they'll usually get involved in some sort of charismatic, i.e. Protestant-leaning kind of movement, because that seems to jive with the theology they've imbibed from the Novus Ordo. Also, parents who go the extra mile of homeschooling and catechizing and bringing their kids to conferences and putting them in camps and all these kinds of things, they do create a very Christian culture around their children where they do intellectually and in their hearts assent to the Catholic faith, but it's not the Novus Ordo that's keeping them there, and we must admit that if we're being intellectually honest. And for every father who does something like that, there's going to be 10 to 15 to 20 or 100 who leave. Think about how many people used to go to your parish and think of how many people go there now. Again, there are general exceptions to this. But as I said, exceptions prove the rule. But other people might say, well, even if the Novus Ordo was bad, we are supposed to just suffer with Jesus. Well, Jesus would be the last person, divine person, to say that we should suffer through something that is deficient and harmful to the faith, because Jesus would tell us that the salvation of our soul is the most important thing, and if something can work against the salvation of our soul, either implicitly or explicitly, then that thing in and of itself should be avoided. Yes, we're called to suffer, but we're not called to participate in things we think are bad in order to suffer. In fact, if there is a martyrdom associated with liturgy, it would be the martyrdom of not having anywhere to go to Mass because there's no worthy worship, which would be the real suffering, rather than saying, well, even though this liturgy is bad, or the way this priest celebrates it's really bad, or the Novus Ordo definitely leans to a Protestant theology, I'm going to go anyway to go there and suffer with Christ. That's not really a Catholic understanding of how we suffer with Christ. We don't partake in things that we think are harmful to others because Christ is being crucified. That's not what we do. If the time comes when we're supposed to be martyred and crucified, then we embrace it, but we don't actively take part in things that we believe are causing spiritual harm to others so that we can console Christ while we're there. Because Christ, if I can speak in a metaphorical sense here, he desires to be with us in eternity, hence why he allowed himself to be crucified. So I don't think he'd want us to take part in something that presents a potential danger to our faith, because that would work against our chances of being with him in eternity. I'm just sort of following the logical conclusion here of these ideas. There are other such things that people will say about why you should attend the Novus Ordo, even if it's bad, and they'll say, well, Jesus Christ is there. Well, Jesus Christ is in a lot of places, and a lot of priests can celebrate Mass in a lot of different ways, and Jesus Christ will be there. But again, if there is abuse, sacrilege, and so on and so forth, we don't get to say, well, Jesus Christ is there. This is not really a Catholic sentiment, because there are any number of things that people could do. They could celebrate Mass in an extremely abusive way. They could have heretical preaching. There could be terrible music. There could be immodesty. There could be plenty of problems that harm the spiritual life of the person who attends. And we can't say, well, Jesus Christ is there. That's not enough, because if we believe Jesus is there, then we should actually be horrified that those things are taking place, because they will be a dishonor to Christ, because immodesty, sacrilege, liturgical abuse, heretical preaching, Protestant theology, these things offend Jesus Christ. So the fact that Jesus is there should actually cause us sorrow. Now, on the subjective end of things, of course, an individual who partakes in one of these things and is ignorant of them, or they don't bother him, and he himself is predisposed to receiving Holy Communion in a worthy way, and does so in a way that contributes to his sanctification, well, in that case, that person, in a relative sense, has received the good of the Mass. But the liturgy itself has presented a grave theological, moral, and aesthetic stumbling block to the sanctification of others. So overall, there's a major problem there. In any case, if I was a Pharisee, I would say, who cares about the spirit of the law? Here's what the letter of the law says. The traditional response is, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. So I'm going to take into account the spirit of the law as the animating principle for the letter. So, if it is the case that we are supposed to go to Mass to sanctify Sunday in the normal sense, then what we do is we say, well, why am I required to go to Mass? Well, I'm required to go to Mass primarily because we're supposed to keep the Lord's Day holy, and the Church has said the normal way of keeping the Lord's Day holy is to go to Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. And generally speaking, it is a mortal sin for us to miss Mass willingly with no moderately grave reason. And I say moderately grave because the old theological manuals that touched on this, they talk about moderately grave, not grave. Meaning, for example, one of the things you can find in these manuals, and for this I suggest reading Dr. Kwasniewski's Substack. He has citations for all these manuals. It says in some of them, if you have to travel an hour or more, then you are dispensed from your Sunday obligation. It's not a hugely grave inconvenience to drive an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. I've done it many times to attend the traditional Latin Mass, especially with bad weather and it taking longer. But the point is that the reasonable, common sense understanding that the Church has always had is that it's a moderately grave reason. Gas is expensive. It's dangerous to drive in cold weather. Whatever the reason is, you're dispensed. You could go, and it'd be good if you did, but you don't have to. You can stay home to care for loved ones. And besides just the physical reasons, there are moral reasons. Long before the Novus Ordo, you can find in the theological manuals that if there is a chance of spiritual harm to yourself or another, then the obligation is not binding. It's not really defined in the manuals what spiritual harm to yourself or another is, and that's kind of the point. I'll give you an example. Dr. K talks about this, I think, in part 3 of his series on attending on Sunday obligation and the Novus Ordo. He says, while it is true that the so-called unicorn Novus Ordo, and the unicorn Novus Ordo is the term, I believe, coined by Taylor Marshall, and it's a Novus Ordo that looks like a Latin Mass. Latin, incense, ad orientem, etc. Well, the funny thing is there's a couple problems. First, the unicorn Novus Ordo isn't really even the Novus Ordo the way the Novus Ordo was intended, and you can understand this by looking at what Pope Paul VI said about the Novus Ordo on the eve of its promulgation, or in publishing the Missal, and he spoke of the fact that we were going to lose all these great traditions. It was going to be absurd, all the problems we'd have, basically is what he's saying, but it's more important that we have the vernacular. So clearly he desired, at least he expressed his desire, that the Novus Ordo was best to be done in the vernacular. So if you do find the Novus Ordo in the Latin, really, it's not even a Novus Ordo that is in keeping with the desires of the Pope who published the Missal in the first place, which presents a grave contradiction. So that in and of itself means if you go to a Novus Ordo that is the unicorn Novus Ordo, you go to one that is against the will of the Pope who promulgated it, which is a problem. And if you go to a Novus Ordo that's not in Latin and doesn't look like the Latin Mass, then you go to a Novus Ordo that does not resemble Catholic liturgy at all and is discombobulating for its own reasons. Furthermore, from a subjective perspective, if you were to go to the Novus Ordo in Latin, putting aside the fact that that wouldn't even demonstrate what Pope Paul VI desired for the Novus Ordo in the first place, which is a problem, you would be attending something that uses a completely different lectionary and is missing certain crucial prayers that, if you are astute in the liturgical calendar of the Church, and if you exclusively attend the traditional Latin Mass, then you are going to be discombobulated by a completely different liturgical paradigm when you go. This is potentially for some, and Dr. K talks about this as being a problem for himself and others, where you will encounter a different ecclesial life. It is discombobulating. And this sort of scenario presents in and of itself an occasion for sin. And why is that the case? Well, if you understand the history of the Novus Ordo, if you understand how the thing is promulgated, if you understand the dubious laicity of the legal side of the things, I'm not saying it's cut and dry with the legal side of things, but there are potential issues. When you understand the Protestantization that was desired by the architect of the Novus Ordo and so on and so forth, when you consider all these factors, it is impossible to separate what you know to be the case about what has happened because of this and still attend the thing. This is it's impossible to think someone could separate those two. This is like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. Somebody who has said terrible things about you and has tarnished your reputation publicly, and someone says, just suck it up and, go have a good time and have tea with him or have coffee with him. Well, obviously, subjectively, you can work these problems out. But the point being is you can't unknow what has happened, and you can't unfeel what has happened. And if the point of going to the liturgy is to attend Mass, to fulfill your Sunday obligation, which requires that you unite yourself to the prayers of the Church and offer worship to God, if there's going to be a grave impediment in the way of that, then that is under the category of spiritual harm to yourself or another, which is covered in the old theological manuals. Anyway, I think that kind of makes sense. So the Pharisaical position would be, again, who cares? Just go because the law says so. Who cares? Jesus is there. Well, again, that's not taking into account of what is honorable or offensive to Jesus, or who cares? Get with the times. You're being a Protestant. You're being a Pharisee. Look at what this bishop said or this pope said, and it goes, whoa. We're just appealing to the letter of things there without the spirit. This is Pharisaical par excellence. And in my experience debating this issue with other Catholics of goodwill, I do encounter what I would consider to be something like a Pharisaical mindset, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So remember what happened to Christ in the Gospels when he is having these conversations with the Pharisees. What happens? What they do is they inevitably try to put Christ into a corner. And why do they do that? As the scriptures tell us, they do that because they want to have a gotcha moment with Christ. They say, haha, Christ, look at this coin. Who's on this coin? And it's Caesar. And they want Christ to have to fall into some sort of theological trap. And he comes with the perfect answer and he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. They try to trap him on the Sabbath day when the apostles are picking wheat. And he says, because they're doing servile work, technically speaking, and he says, which one of you would not get your ox out of the ditch if it fell into a ditch on the Sabbath? And they kind of walk away and go, oh yeah, okay, I guess. Or, he was without sin cast the first stone, and they all walk away instead of stoning the poor woman. This is what Pharisees do. They present situations where they make a false dichotomy to try to trap you to make you a heretic, a schismatic, whatever. This is like what pro-choicers do to pro-lifers when they'll say things like, if you were really pro-life, if you were on a ship, and I've seen this before, if you were on a ship and you had to get off and you could only take a cryo chamber with 30,000 embryos, or you could take one child, who would you save? If you're really pro-life, you would take the cryo chamber with 30,000 embryos, because that's, by your belief, 30,000 people. So if you only take the baby who's alive and you can see the baby, you're a hypocrite. You don't actually believe in the pro-life position. This is an absurd situation. First of all, this doesn't exist, so arguing it is a complete moot point. Second of all, there's no possible way in a scenario like that someone could make an informed decision without duress and stress, therefore having some sort of teased out, rationalistic, logical discussion about the matter isn't even available. The person will make a decision in that moment to take the human being who they have an emotional attachment to, and the sadness of this absurdity of the embryos being cast into the sea because the ship sinks is sort of just a tragic event that took place in an equally tragic and absurd situation. This has nothing to do with the pro-life position. So when people will say things like, well, you can't tell me you would never attend the traditional looking Novus Ordo, even if you just had to go one time, there's no way you can argue that. And it's like, well, first of all, in my experience, the traditional Novus Ordo does not exist, I don't think, in the entire country of Canada. The Oratorians that are 3.5 hours away from me might do it. I don't know. Second of all, pretty much everywhere on earth where you go and find a so-called traditional Novus Ordo, which is an oxymoron because the Novus Ordo is not part of Catholic tradition, when you go and find a traditional Novus Ordo, you will also find a traditional Latin Mass. I actually, of all the locations that exist, I can't really think of a place where the traditional Novus Ordo is offered where there is not a traditional Latin Mass within about an hour. If there is one, let me know. So it's not even a real situation because the situation doesn't exist. It's just a hypothetical that people say as a type of Pharisaical gotcha to Jesus Christ. But the underlying principles still remain. The worthiness of the liturgy, the situation of the situation in which the liturgy is conducted, the intentions of why the liturgy was promulgated, the effect that the experience of the liturgy will have on your soul. All of these things must come into play, and those are ultimately subjective for the person, hence why the old theological manuals talk about spiritual harm to yourself or another, which isn't really defined, because ultimately it's up to the person to make those decisions for themselves, and no one's in a position to say so-and-so is a Pharisee, a schismatic, or a Protestant because they come to a different conclusion than them. And herein lies the hypocrisy of this anti-traditional opinion. It is the anti-traditionalists who clamor on about tetrads being Pharisees, Protestants, schismatics, and so forth, but they themselves are acting like those. Because what are they doing? They're accusing. And Christ says that Satan is the accuser. So if you're saying, I have a different opinion than you, and I'm going to not go to this Mass, and someone says you're outside the church, this person is acting in a satanic way. They're accusing you of something of which they have no right to accuse you of. They have no evidence to accuse you of. And they're also just simply wrong about it. And they're leveling at you some sort of emotionally charged response that doesn't have any grounding in Catholic theology. Anyway, consequently, the opinion that Dr. Kwasniewski holds in his writings is pretty much exactly what the general consensus is amongst priests of the Society of St. Pius X, in that because of the dangers inherent in the Novus Ordo paradigm as such, and the discombobulation it brings to the spiritual life for someone who's been calibrated in the old ways of doing things. Because of that, it cannot be the case that you would be bound to do that for a Sunday or holy day, because the point of going to Mass is to sanctify the Lord's Day. So being in a state of spiritual anguish makes it very difficult to sanctify the day. Pretty simple. You may disagree with that opinion, and you are free to disagree with that opinion, but you are not free to say to somebody that they're falling into something like Pharisaicalism, Donatism, schismatical attitudes, or Protestantism because of that. Unless you have evidence that that person is adopting what is a schismatic opinion, meaning they don't believe the Pope is the Pope or that other Catholics are Catholics. And I should qualify there, I know that there are sedevacantists who would reject the schismatic opinion. I'm speaking equivocally here. Or if you can't say that they're being Protestant, especially if they're rejecting Protestantism. That's absurd. You can't say they're being Donatists. Donatists essentially reject the idea that other priests are priests because they are sinners. That's historically kind of what Donatism was. That's not the opinion either. It really is its own unique position. It's a response to a novel liturgy in a unique time in a very confusing crisis in the Church. And Catholics need to be giving traditionalists and otherwise the utmost of charity in these confusing times when people are just simply trying to wade through the mess and save their souls. I hope that made sense. I guess we'll find out. This has been the Kennedy Report. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.